I have wondered whether your mother. I mean, so you're
pissed. She was pissed.
Okay.
Because I was named in 1989. It was an obscure name. She was going for something that had like charm and a feeling of exoticism.
Right.
My older brother's name is Orpheus.
That's it. Yeah.
And so they needed something that was sort of fit in the that mythological vogue that was something obscure but interesting.
Right.
Like when I meet people, I clarify I came out before the film.
Yeah.
And people are always surprised. Like, oh, like that's, like people really think that I was named after the Disney movie.
Right.
And that is so embarrassing for me. Like, it's embarrassing. Like, I feel embarrassment for my mom that people think that she, like, loved the Disney movie so much that she named her kid after it. Like, that was not the deal. That's not what happened. So we don't know anything about what the story is going to be, how it's going to change for the new Aladdin film. But we can look at the old Aladdin film and then what changed from the original story there. And so there's this sort of progression of updating these stories for a more modern age. The one thing we know about the new film is that Jasmine's going to be given a little bit more of a role as like a strong female character instead of a character that in the original Disney film and the original story, she just made mistakes and like made things like she fell for tricks and traps and like got Aladdin in trouble and he had to save her, like a typical damsel in distress situation. I don't think they're going to do that, which is exciting. Getting into the darker world of the Aladdin myth, the one thing that Disney really improved on is that they addressed something that the original story did not address, and that is the idea of having a subservient genie as a metaphor for slave labor. It was very explicit in the original story that there were two genies, and they were called the Slave of the Ring and the Slave of the Lamp. And this goes with the genie mythology. Genie is the, sort of Americanized European version of the jinn, which is a sort of demon spirit figure from... it's really pre-Islamic. It got worked into the Quran and is part of Islamic culture. But the jinn were known, far before there was a Quran. And so the idea of them being subservient in mythology is more of a metaphor for controlling the powers of nature themselves, because these are creatures that are fundamentally part of the fabric of the supernatural order of things, and they would have control over things like the weather or good fortune, things like that. And so there is like what I would describe as a non-problematic version of having a servant that is a jinn. Like that's the mythos. The Aladdin story didn't exist until the early 1700s and was first published during the height of the transatlantic slave trade and was directed at European audiences in a way that made slave labor look powerful and exciting. So every supernatural element to a story can be looked at both as its literal representation in that story, like the jinn, magical creatures, or in any good literature, there's usually a metaphor there. There's the supernatural is being employed for a reason. And so like classical mythology, the metaphor was the power of nature. In this story, it feels like, to me, it is just a metaphor for the power of slavery and served as sort of a balming agent for the addled nerves of the Europeans who knew slavery was wrong. Like, at no point during the fervor of like having human bondage, like was there ever a point where everyone was just cool with it? It was always a conversation culturally, and the people in power kept it going. And so art, literature, culture, religion, politics, science were all employed in sort of a grand scheme in different ways to convince the population that slavery is good and fine. And a lot of that has to do with the dehumanization of whoever you're enslaving. And so the genie as a metaphor for the enslaved Africans has this like dark, uncomfortable confluence to it. And I don't know if it was specifically intentioned like that. I don't feel like it was. The original story comes from a Syrian storyteller who told a bunch of stories to a French translator. It was never included in the original Arabian Nights. none of the most famous Arabian Nights stories were ever included in the original Arabian Nights. Aladdin, Sinbad, Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves all came from this one storyteller that a French translator, met and like just kept collecting, because the Arabian Nights were very popular. They were selling very well. He had translated all of them and just needed more stories. And so this is one of those stories that, unfortunately, when it was introduced into the culture, served a second purpose, whether that was intentional or not.
So it's placed in India, right? Or
China. The original story is set in China.
Whoa.
Yeah, Aladdin is Chinese. There's a bunch of Arabic characters in it. And there's some confusion about why it's set in China, what the relevance is.
Okay. What's it coded as in the Disney film? Because it feels...
The place?
Yeah.
Okay, so
like
the
Taj
location of the original Disney film was supposed to be Baghdad.
Okay.
And then, as they were making the movie, the United States bombed the shit out of Baghdad.
Oh my god.
So they changed the location to the mythical Agrabah, which is modeled on the Baghdad of the 700s AD, when the story takes place. So it should be noted, the original Aladdin story is episodic. Things happen, sort of get resolved, and then a new crisis emerges, gets resolved, another crisis emerges, gets resolved. It was a little bit looser, free-flowing. In general, a tale about rags to riches, rise to power, boy becomes a man. The original Disney film, the animated one, which they will be remaking to whatever extent it's the same, different, really focuses on the coming of age. And I don't think they're going to work in one of the episodes that from the original story, but what I would really like to see is the story of the sorcerer who did the Jafar of the story, tricking the Jasmine of the story. They all have different names in the original one, but tricking her into asking the genie to bring her a roc's egg, which is a strange moment in the story that has left literary scholars a little confused, scratching their heads. Jafar knows that the genie cannot fetch a roc's egg, but he convinces Jasmine that she needs to have one to hang from the highest hall in her palace as a sign of her power. Jasmine then tells Aladdin, hey, the thing I want the most right now is a roc's egg. Have your genie get it for me. Aladdin asks the genie. Genie flips the fuck out. Genie goes wild and says, how dare you ask me to get the roc's egg? That is my master. I am the servant of the roc's egg. I'm not going to betray my master for you. And he flies into a rage, and I think he abandons Aladdin at that time, or at least is just really mad at him. I don't remember how it resolves exactly, except that everyone was wondering what's going on with that. Why is the roc's egg the master of the genie? And so there's some things to know. What is a rock? It's a giant bird. It's a big bird. Okay. It's mythological, considered mythological now. I believe Marco Polo was the first person to write about the rock. He claims to have seen one, or at least spread the sort of word of this thing from his travels in the Orient. Giant bird capable of lifting an elephant off the ground. So, that was kind of the punchline for the rock.
Bird.
Big bird. And one of my favorite authors, his name is Arthur Machen. He was a horror writer and an occultist from the late 1800s, early 1900s. And he wrote in one of his autobiographies about his early studies in alchemy and reading the tales of the alchemists and their strange books of metaphors and symbols and riddles. And he, in that reflection on his life, leaves the reader with a riddle. He refers to all the alchemical stories and tales and poems that he read, and then mentions, just the other day, he says, I was rereading the old tale of Aladdin, and I was astounded to discover that the genie describes his master as the roc's egg. And then Arthur Machen doesn't elaborate on why he was astounded or what that meant to him, but it's in the section on alchemy. And so I had this moment of I'm interested in that story. I love Arthur Machen, and I love alchemy, so what's the connection here? What's happening? And I had to do a little bit of research. There's only one alchemical text that I know of that deals with rocks, that talks about rocks. And it is Michael Myers' Atalanta Fugians, which is an alchemical text from probably the 1620s, I think. He was a Rosicrucian. He was an alchemist, this guy Michael Meyer, and he wrote a lot of books and had them illustrated. Like, they're beautiful. I know this book because of the illustrations, and I've like colored a few of them, and I look at them as reference. And I never spent too much time with the text itself because it's full of mysteries. But I remembered that there's one chapter on eggs specifically, and that's what I thought of when like the roc's egg, alchemy. I wonder if like Michael Myers got a scoop for me. Sure enough, he references the rock in the first couple sentences of this chapter on the philosopher's egg, which is sort of a metaphor for, this is going to go deep, but the cosmic egg is an ancient symbol of fertility and growth, renewal. The Easter egg comes from like deep pagan beliefs in sort of that symbol as a universal life figure. And by the time of the Orphic mystery cults in the late antiquity period, the cosmic egg had developed as a very coherent mythological symbol of the whole universe being enshrined in an egg and us at the center of that yolk. And there were these ideas of what the different layers represented. And Michael Meyer goes into all of this in his book and talks about the different applications of the philosophical egg and literal eggs and how, and the different qualities of birds. That's why he references the rock as like the sort of grandest figure of the birds, and then goes down and ends up using the chicken as his main example of how eggs work and what their occult properties are. And then Michael Myers ends his text, his chapter on eggs, with another mystery, which is, he asks the question, so if this philosophical egg, is so important, it begs the question, what kind of egg is it? What kind of bird lays the cosmic egg? My answer, I believe that Arthur Machen's riddle and Michael Myers' riddles answer one another, that the significance of the rock's egg is that it is the cosmic egg, and that these two works are somehow in dialogue with one another. And tying all of this together is the belief, one of the things that's attributed to the rock is that if you eat its egg, you'll be granted immortality. It is an elixir of life, in the same way that the philosopher's stone or the alchemical magnum opus is an elixir of life. And those two qualities relating to one another are then further compounded by an ancient Hindu god named Garuda, who was a bird god, who had a Promethean role in the text that he was a part of stealing from the heavens the elixir of life. And what's really interesting about this, and this is something I just learned about doing a little bit of research into the rock and the alchemical correlations, is that Garuda is specifically represented. So Hindu art, you see the same figures represented over and over again in like temples and manuscripts. They will copy the same sort of hands, gestures, poses, like they are iconic in and of themselves. And color schemes are also really important. And Garuda is described in one of the sacred texts of like how to represent these figures. Garuda is always represented with 4 colors, and that's black, white, red, and yellow, which happen to be the 4 colors of the alchemical process, which is coded in many books. And there's different versions of these colors, but the standard model is black, white, red, and yellow. And if I can remember the sort of, there are different processes in creating the philosopher's stone and creating the elixir of life. So this is all to say that there are some really interesting connections between the Aladdin mythos and the sort of Arabian inclination for occult magic and alchemy, like came out of really Hellenistic Egypt, but spread throughout the Middle East and became a curious practice. And I think it's been woven into, in a very strange way, this idea of the universe as being part of a process of alchemy and being accessible through certain knowledge. There's certain things you can learn, is what the story is telling us about what the secrets of the universe are. And the rock's egg, in this case, being one of those sort of cheat codes to the universe, in the same way that the genies are. Supernatural magic as a way to become something greater than yourself. Except that the Aladdin story gives a hint and then doesn't go any further, and like left a lot of people baffled. And to me, that's indicative of the original teller of the tale probably being aware of the mythology of alchemy, and how it relates to classical myth. More so than probably the Europeans that then published and then spread the story all around.
Well, that's my theory, at least.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay.
So that's a deep dive into just some of the,
Right.
stuff you can look at with the Aladdin story.
Well, that's to mention that I've never even encountered. First, I remember you posting somewhere like the actual Pinocchio stories. I started reading it. I think I read like a couple of chapters, and I was like, "This is phenomenal and so totally different than Pinocchio, what I'm familiar with." And like, this is an instance where, because what you just articulated is so far from what you're given.
Yeah.
With the original story, and I
and the Disney really is just not touching the rock. It would be really cool to see just a giant, like I'd be down for just a giant flying bird, no metaphor at all, because that's sweet, especially if it picks up an elephant. Like I want to see that on camera. And then I just have this like faint glimmer of hope that the movie will attempt to approach the idea of the supernatural with some interest in how the supernatural elements of the story have come out of traditions of actual folk superstition, belief, worship, and various like specific religious ideas.
Well, what is the function generally of like a fairy tale or a tale like this? Because it seems to me like, I don't know where you get that hope from, because to me the Disney apparatus and the sort of like popular culture kind of like phenomenon just is pretty devoid of like really any fidelity,
and they don't,
and I might be completely, like it might be there and it's over my head. It's not something I look into.
Personally, I think it's fine to use, and it's probably better to use these stories as fodder for new stories. Like we don't need to tell the same tales over and over again, and the stories we tell, I think, are really it's important to understand them in the context of their time, and like the kinds of stories we need today aren't the kinds of stories we used to need. The function of fairy tales, of which the Arabian Nights is not supposed to be children's literature. Do you know the frame story?
No, I mean I know that in the original Disney, there's a character who starts the whole thing.
Okay, no. All right, we're going to get real dark for a second here. The original frame story is about a king who, I believe his heart gets broken. And so he, instead of ever falling in love again, he takes a new lover every night and then kills her at the end of the night. And that's his deal. And so eventually a woman comes to him after he's been doing this for a while, who understands that's what he does. And instead of letting him have his way with her and then kill her, she decides to tell him a story to keep him distracted. And tells him a story all night long and then ends it with a cliffhanger. And he wants to know how it ends, so he lets her live. And she does this for 1001 nights. Those are the 1001 nights that is under the threat of death, a woman is placating the Sultan to sustain herself. And so it's dark, and
wow.
Yeah. I actually don't know how it resolves in the end. My theory is he falls in love with her and he probably stays the Sultan. Like, I doubt he gets any comeuppance at all.
It's just a cliffhanger. That's how it.
But so that would actually be amazing if the whole book had a cliffhanger. I don't know. I gotta look into it. But so that's, and Aladdin's not actually one of the Arabian those stories, but it is part of that canon, which were originally there was a lot of sex and violence, and just it wasn't for children in the same way that fairy tales, which are still very violent, were. The function of fairy tales is to expose children to the harsh realities of life through story, in order for them to have some familiarity with like death and betrayal and like loss of loved ones.
To be genuinely prepared
for the things
for life in a way that
and I don't know that the Arabian Nights could be said to function in that way.
Okay.
They really feel like tales of wonder and enchantment that are designed to excite you. That's how that was their function in the 1001 Nights themselves. These are just exciting stories and you just want to know what happens next.
Right.
And some of them are morality tales, and some of them have no clear morality, and just like weird shit happens, bad things happen, and like not,
interesting.
the good people don't necessarily win in the end.
Sounds.
But certainly in the tales that were added, the so-called orphan tales that were added in the 1700s, they do tend to be more upbeat and like more palatable to a European audience. No surprise.
So I want to get back into the question of slavery, because I don't feel like we really fleshed it out completely. Like, what is Genie's... I mean, like, so the end of the film...
they did a great job resolving the idea of the master-slave relationship, which was that Aladdin sets the genie free. Now, it's still problematic that Aladdin, like, has someone under bondage that he commands them to do things. And it's more palatable for the audience because the genie is enthusiastic about serving his role and seems to like Aladdin and seems to care about him. And when control of the genie passes to Jafar, for example, he's still rooting for Aladdin. So we have this idea of like a real friendship between them. But like ultimately, the genie doesn't have a choice. And so there isn't a real... he cannot consent to being the servant. He's just forced into it.
So it's interesting that the genie is actually not a protagonist at all. He's really an ancillary character throughout, which is sort of, I guess, a colonial kind of like power dynamic.
He's there to add. Yep, he is as like crucial to the. Well, he doesn't have his own arc. He just wants one thing, and Aladdin refuses to give it to him earlier in the film, and then finally by the end is like, okay, I have everything else I want. I can set the genie free, and that's good. And like, it's good enough for what it is. The original story, there's no setting the genie free. There's just, well, I have all the power. I have the woman, all of the kingdom. Like, it's just about the acquisition of power and living happily ever after under those circumstances.
Right.
And that happily ever after is pretty specifically limited to Aladdin, the tyrant, so to speak.
Interesting. And the original Disney films were pretty racist.
They got hit real hard for representing Arab stereotypes, like cutting off the hands for the crime of thieving. The lyrics to the opening song were protested by...
Really? Huh.
They were protested by, I think, a Muslim group, and that Disney actually changed some of their lyrics to satisfy those complaints.
Uh-huh.
And the group still wasn't happy, and was they met them sort of halfway. But so it continued to be something that, it's not considered to look favorably upon the Arab characters.
Which we can get into sort of like both that and the gender dynamics. But going back
gender
to
dynamics are bad. Real bad. It's rough.
But going back to the genie, I feel like the actual conversation that's going on about Aladdin right now is mostly, Will Smith and
100%.
Will Smith's sort of like filling the
He's
shoes
taken a lot of the attention
of Robin Williams, which in sort of like with this background a little bit, you know, is so not really the important like conversation to be having, and yet that's hands down the conversation that like I feel like when I watched it I was like, oh man, I can't, you know, like I mean, Robin
the
Williams
film's
was so iconic.
already been hit with some questions about brown face and like painting, tanning actors, like background actors. They've done a pretty good job hiring people of color to fill the main roles. I think they added just like some random white guy as a character because they just couldn't not have some random white guy in there as, you know.
Though Aladdin looks pretty old. He looks like he
seems too old. And then have you seen Jafar?
He looks pretty
young. Yeah. So, which really changes the dynamic of their relationship and really takes away, I think, from something that the original story provided, which was a harsher, darker look at the coming of age, boy to man, loss of innocence, loss of virginity, and then the fear of sexual rivals. Like Jafar is Aladdin's sexual rival in the original Aladdin movie. That's the way in which his antagonism manifests. He takes Jasmine from Aladdin, and then in their final showdown, he becomes a huge throbbing snake, and Aladdin has to like do battle with this giant phallic symbol. And like throughout the movie, like Jafar's symbol is the snake, and he represents, like any good literature, they're also all metaphors. Every supernatural element in the story sort of stands in for something else. And in the case of Aladdin, it's all sexual. It's all about the sexuality of a heteronormative young man finding out about his interest in women, pursuing it, and then dealing with the consequences of becoming sexually active. And one of those consequences is a new awareness of the universe and new enemies, new challengers. Previously, his only concern at the beginning of the film is finding bread to eat and like feeding himself. And then he falls in love, and suddenly there's this whole new world of challenges that come for him that he has to, you know, deal with. So Jafar specifically, his magic, you see it as the it kind of represents the toxic masculine generative power. Whereas Aladdin, you see him mostly throughout the film making the right choices. His is the idea of this like positive generative male power. All right, let's go through all the supernatural elements in this movie real fast. We open with the first magic stuff that's happening. Cave of Wonders is a yonic symbol. That means vaginal. And in this movie, it specifically references Jasmine's vagina. It's shaped like a tiger. The entrance is a tiger. And it says that only, I forget how they phrase it, but like basically only the chosen one can enter. Only the purest of heart. I think they say only like the diamond in the rough can enter, which implies this someone at the beginning of their process of transformation, which is what Aladdin goes through. And of course, the tiger is Jasmine's symbol. She has a tiger named Raj. And so when we see tigers, we associate them with Jasmine, especially when in this case, when the tiger is also a giant yonic symbol. So he goes in, he enters this new sort of erotic awakening in the Cave of Wonders. It's all treasure, it's all glitter, it's all gold. And then he discovers his own male generative power in the form of the lamp, which he rubs in order to activate. And when he does that, he produces the genie, who is like the sort of like, I was like sitting there like, is the genie just a metaphor for his dick? Like, is it just like a giant throbbing erection that is just like spewing all over? And I kind of settled on the idea that the genie represents his adolescent male energy. This like thing that comes on, that joins him, that becomes part of his voice. And ultimately at the end of the film, once he resolves his sort of inner conflicts and external conflicts, it leaves him as he sort of grows up to be a man and doesn't need the sort of tricks and whimsy and sort of magic of this youthful period. And the genie is, he's have you seen Big Mouth?
No.
Okay. in Big Mouth, it's a TV show about kids coming of age, and they have one supernatural sort of thing that is the hormone monsters that follow these kids around and represent all these aspects of their...
Is this an animated film that's on Netflix
it's on
now?
Netflix,
Yes,
yeah.
I have watched it,
Yes.
and I really appreciate
It's absolutely outrageous. It's really good. Everyone should watch Big Mouth. It's fucking awesome. The genie is basically one of these hormone monsters.
it. Right, totally.
That's how I see it. I'd love to just go through every frame of the Whole New World video, the whole song they sing, because it's pretty loaded with, like, every shot is a phallic or yonic image. And, like, we don't have to go through it all. Maybe...
But, oh my God,
we can do a little breakaway where we just talk about this one video, because I went through and it's just like the magic carpet ride, the Vitruvian circular temple is a phallus, the arabesque domes is a phallus, Aladdin gives Jasmine a lotus, which is a yonic symbol. The cloud scene, they go into the clouds and they, like, when they first go through, it's like this, like, channel of clouds that is, like, very yonic, and that is, like, the whole scene is just a metaphor for them having sex, and Jasmine specifically losing her virginity. Aladdin as well, I believe, is represented as losing his virginity here because he's dressed in white, sort of in a bridal white. And then, like, when they're in the clouds, they're, like, playing with the clouds, and, like, it's, like, him twisting her nipple. Like, it's so explicit. And then I just, like, paused it by accident on this one shot where they both catch clouds. And it's, like, in where I paused it, it's very clear they're both just holding, like, butts. And like, they're not in the clouds. They're in a bed and they're, like, you know, gripping one another, and they, like, have this, like, magical metaphor version of, like, what's really happening. So it starts on a terrace and he's like, please, like, I want to show you a whole new world, and they fly off together. But, like, you can also look at, so that's, like, the supernatural literal version, but the metaphors, they do not leave the terrace. He shows her a whole new world by them. They're just having sex. And, like, the first time... So I wanted to learn a whole new world so that I could whip it out as, like, a fun party trick. Like, haha, Aladdin knows this song. Like, that's funny. And so, like, a couple years ago, I was like, okay, I'm going to learn the song. It'll be really funny. And it was while I was learning the song and I was like, oh, this is, like, implicitly about losing your virginity. It never occurred to me, but it's just so clear now. And then I watched the video and just, like, every little thing was like, oh, I'm an idiot. How did I miss this? I, like, went and Googled, like, is Aladdin's Whole New World about losing your virginity? And, like, I'm not the first person to realize this.
And, you know, it was that song I was saying earlier that I, like, my first crush was one of my mother's piano students who was also she doesn't know that I had a crush on her, by the way, so
surprise.
But
just don't say her name. She doesn't have to know.
She'll know who I don't know. But anyway, I remember actually sort of, like, falling in love with her while she's playing that song specifically. Yeah. And just sort of, like,
how much of it was her and how much of it was the song, it's hard to say. It's just one of those, like,
I was 12 probably, so I wasn't in
that's kind of the...
So have you ever considered going by a different name? Were you deterred enough in your interactions? Because you are, like, you're a white guy.
Yeah. And it has been, like, job interviews and other sort of, like, any time where I don't present my face before revealing my name, I think there's a lot of assumptions that get made about who I am and what my ethnic origins might be. That has never worked to my detriment that I know of. It may be that I've applied to a lot of jobs that I didn't get called back for, but I don't sort of attribute that to discrimination. I always get pulled at the airport because they make their little random lists without seeing me first. Costa Rica, especially, I go there about every year, and I have never not been screened by security.
Wow. Randomly
selected from a group of 200 passengers. They'll randomly select 10 people. I get picked every time. And there's very rarely anyone of Arabic descent that's actually traveling. It's like and I've never gotten to, like, look and see, like, well, did they pick out the other person that might have an Arabic name? Because it just hasn't been relevant. But I do definitely feel like they look at the list and say, gotta check that one.
Wow.
Which is, like,
Wow.
Yeah. And I found out that the name Aladdin made it onto the Homeland Security's like big list of words that they sort of search for to analyze terrorist activity.
What?
Because it gets used as like a code. I don't know like why or how. I hope I did this. I should probably look into this again before sharing it as fact, because this was like 6 years ago or something.
You can omit it if you don't want to say
if we need to.
it.
But I think it's true. I believe this is a real thing. It was a long time ago that I first was indignant about it. But they just have a huge list of keywords that they look for patterns in social media posts. And Aladdin is a slur for people from the Middle East. And I don't know how much that relates to...
That'd be funny if that's actually the what the name sort of like it's vernacular.
Yeah.
And it wasn't actually a name of a person ever. It was just he's an Aladdin. He's a Chad.
I'm pretty glad that's not.
I had one other thought, but I forget what it is.
It's cool.
Oh yeah, no. So like, do you think that because your name was Aladdin, you had to sort of like wrestle with yourself in a way earlier, and sort of like
decide what my real identity was,
like take life with irony, as like, because a name really is a pretty...
I mean, it definitely had an effect on my development, at least to the extent where I was always ready to sort of be defensive and or aggressive in social situations where that like change happened, where somebody like starts going after me. And it was like very common on the playground. Like, it was just that was the thing. I don't know if it helped me grow more into who I really am, but it did give me a relationship with the world around me. Like meeting, like as a 8-year-old child, meeting an adult man that hears my name and then starts making fun of me, like that was something that I experienced a lot. Like people couldn't help it.
Interesting.
and so it gave me this idea that I was potentially at odds with the world, that there had to be this sort of natural defense that I had to be ready for. And that I had to be able to like stand up to adults and be I don't think that's funny. Like that doesn't make me laugh. Like
that's cool. That's good. I mean, like,
so I think, maybe it might have worked to my benefit in the end. And ultimately I'm grateful for the name. Like I had, experiences being bullied in the past when I was a kid.
Mm-hmm.
Like it didn't bring me down enough that it gave me any real complexes. And now people know, like people remember my name.
Yeah,
like
totally.
It's one of those, you meet me and then I, am someone that you don't forget. Which sometimes I get a lot of people that remember me that I don't remember, but that's a consequence that I'm willing to deal with for the general notoriety.
I'm Alex, by the way.
This is Alex.
Nice to meet you.
I'm Aladdin.
And that is our first episode.
We're talking, of we're
Rat Lab.
building something. We're developing a new. It's a whole thing.
And
I just want to address,
Yeah.
Thank you for watching.
It might not always be the.
This won't be the format forever.
Right. Yeah. But this is
we're the guys.
First thing.
This is our first thing we're doing. We just set up the studio. We got the lights. We got the sound.
And
we had a topic.
My beer.
We're drinking. We weren't. That was a last minute thing. We just had the beers. We're like, should we drink on camera? We don't know. We're still figuring it out.
It's
I mean,
still
this time we
family
did. We are going for. Yeah, we're going for family friendly. Or like,
We'd like you to be friendly.
Probably 10. Yeah, probably like 10 and up.
Yeah.
Or like 12, maybe 12 and up. The sexuality stuff, the kids can't.
No, I don't think that anything we've really talked about. Oh, well, I mean, like, I guess.
I dropped some F words, or I said the F
No,
word.
you didn't.
I did. I said the F word one time at least.
Really?
Yeah. It was.
Wow, that's how decent. That's how little.
I
it
was
matters.
like, yeah. I said it one time. Sorry, children.
Thank you for tuning in.
Thanks for watching.
We'll see what comes next.
Yeah. Hell yeah, we will.
Sweet.